This is a video about Blaire White. It's called Blaire White, Here's Why Other Trans People Hate Me. So, I would... with this type of title, what I would assume, or what would make the most logical sense, would be for Blaire White to say, hey, this reason why trans people don't like me is because I'm generally invalidating of other trans people. That's pretty much what I would say, right? Now obviously it's not going to be that. It's going to be something about free speech. I don't know. I'm just assuming. But yeah, she's very, not only does she have like opinions that generally align outside of, you know, what normal trans people will have, or the typical trans person might have, which is okay, but she's also very like hyperbolic about it. She's annoying about it, you know what I mean? You know, I guess things like the whole the defense of, I guess, J.K. Rowling with the TERF perspective. But you know what's really interesting? I remember watching like a whole like 3 or 4 hour documentary on her or something, or 2 or 3, whatever, from The Right Opinion. And Blaire is very invalidating, or at least previously has been very invalidating of non-medical trans people. So people who identify but don't necessarily take the steps to like transition. And what's so interesting about that is it makes sense as to why she would defend J.K. Rowling for being like a TERF, right? So traditional or like older feminists are generally are generally invalidating of trans women because they don't have a similar experience, right? A lot of, I'd say a pretty heavy chunk of the ways in which women are oppressed is through their developmental cycle, where they're discouraged from going towards certain career paths and encouraged to do things that are more like, you know, homely, or is that, I mean, I guess homely means ugly, right? But you know what I mean, like take care of the home and et cetera, et cetera. And so a trans woman, generally speaking, you know, if they grew up identifying as a male, they wouldn't understand that experience as a woman. And so that's why that would be where a lot of older feminists, I guess you'd call those TERFs, come from. And I understand it. I do understand it. I just disagree. You know, I think that obviously, you know, trans women belong in a feminist space. This is intersectionality 101, you know, different identities conflicting. Because there are still issues women face once they've matured as well. But it makes sense because I think that Blaire has a similar perspective on non-binary trans people, where she feels that those people don't understand her struggle as somebody who's going through like going through the process from a medical perspective, which I also understand, right? You know, it's two, I guess you'd say, different types of trans people who are more identifying and maybe just need to express themselves differently through like clothing, and like a trans medical person, you know, somebody who goes through like hormones, therapy, et cetera, which obviously, in my opinion, going through hormones and therapy and all that, and like that massive shift is much more stressful. So I can understand why Blaire White wouldn't consider those people as valid. Wouldn't consider them as valid. Anyway, Blaire White, here's why other trans people hate me. Let's see what this has. It's on the Daily fucking Wire. You know what I mean? Like, I have no expectation of this being good. Well, let's get it.
It is one of those things where once you take stances that are unpopular, you become sort of unpopular in certain segments.
I have never been denied a single thing. The problem might just be you. Have you ever?
Well, here's the thing. Listen, I'm not super duper educated on this, but my understanding is that the unanimous decision is that yes, Jessica Yaniv is not a good person. And so what I think is interesting is that we've started with like, oh, I've had perspectives that people find unpopular, and then you shift to Jessica Yaniv, which people, I think, supported her position on this girl, because like this is my understanding, not a great person, right? And I'm not super educated on it, but what I'm more interested in is the framing of this starts with like, oh, I've had opinions that aren't so popular. Here's Jessica Yaniv, somebody that's not a good person, and then what this signals to you is like, oh wow, the left defends Jessica Yaniv. What a piece of shit. That's what, because people in the chat are saying that she's a predator, and I haven't looked into it specifically, but you know.
Ever consider the problem is you and not trans people?
No.
Okay, well, I'm here to tell you the problem is you and not trans people.
This is what the left does to all minorities, which is try to instruct them how to think, try to instruct them what they need to believe in. Like, I don't care who you are, what you really believe, as long as you're voting in the direction.
This is the thing, is that there's a level of truth to that, somewhat. But the problem is like Blaire's not your typical, marginalized individual who just votes against the status quo. She's also very like she would use in a derogatory term the word. I don't even know. I'm not even going to say it. But she would use, in very derogatory terms towards trans people. And she would invalidate other trans people, et cetera, et cetera.
Action of freedom, and that's all I care about.
I think that you and I definitely agree on a lot of this. For me, I'd rather have a conversation sort of about the logic behind your stance. I feel like I'm always damage controlling for the trans community, which is so frustrating.
So I'm a YouTuber, and I'm definitely more so known for being the queen of controversy. That's kind of what people call me. I have a lot of takes on my channel that maybe other people in my community don't typically have. So
here's the thing with Blaire White, right? Like, okay, in my experience, thank you so much for this, my man. In my experience, so I've been a controversial figure before, not nearly as big as Blaire White. I was a large TikToker, right? Like 2.5 mil, and I would say things controversial to get like attention, and it's not something that you necessarily do actively, but you kind of like, it almost gets wired into your brain very, weirdly, and that's what led to my ban ultimately. Not to get into specifics, and I'm happy about it because I was in a bad headspace, and that's why I know that there's a difference between like saying things that are unpopular opinions and being controversial. Like, I think I say a lot of things that are unpopular opinions on here, but I don't do it in a controversial way. Like what I just started with. Hey, I understand why Blaire White has this particular perspective on it, right? And I get it. Right, like that's like, you would consider that like maybe that's a little controversial, but that's not like a controversial way to express that opinion. Like so it's really more about the way that she expresses her opinions rather than what opinions she has, and that's the problem more than anything else. And so I don't like it when people kind of conflate the two. It's like, oh well, I say things that are not usually said, like an asshole. You know what I mean? Like, of course it's gonna be very different. If you displayed your perspective in a better way, you're not gonna get so much hate.
Which is fine, or at least it should be. You tend to get blackballed a little bit when you do, black sheeped a little bit when you do. Real life is definitely kinder, but online, just search my name up and the word trans, and you'll see a lot of crazy comments about me. Trans sports, that's probably the one I've taken the most heat for, is feeling as though it isn't fair for trans women to compete in sports with biological women, at least in the overwhelming majority of cases.
I'm quite disappointed for the female.
So this is like another thing. Like, it's weird that I'm like educated enough on Blaire to talk about this because, okay, I have a similar perspective where like I'm uneasy about trans women competing in sports, and I'm not going to get into this specific conversation, but I guarantee you, if I sat down with somebody and had a conversation with them about it, it would be a reasonable discussion, and you'd say, okay, maybe I disagree, but I understand why you're saying that. Blaire White, the people aren't upset because she has a perspective that trans women shouldn't compete in sports. People are upset because she took Janae Marie Kroc, which is a very established individual, is a trans bodybuilder, well, powerlifter, very accomplished individual. I respect them a lot. I used to watch them when they identified as Matt Krasinski. And she lied about that person, saying that this person like wanted to compete in women's sports, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll show you what the Janae looks like. I don't know if I spelled her name right. I just spelled everybody. Yeah. So this is like what Janae looks like. And so Janae's gone through like a whole story. There's like a whole thing on Netflix. I should watch it. I would encourage you to watch it. Very respectable person. They invented the croc row. I used to be into lifting. And this is somebody that's just like lifts for fun and like doesn't try to compete. And Blaire lied about them saying like, oh, they wanted to compete with women, et cetera, et cetera. And literally when the source material that Blaire read, that was just completely discounted. So that's why people are upset, because Blaire lied about Blaire took this person and like pointed to them and said like, look, this person is a bad person for doing a particular thing, but they didn't even want to do the bad. They didn't even want to do the thing she was claiming that they did. And so this is what I'm saying. Like this, when you do stuff like this, when you remove that half of the context, you are not apologetic about the bad thing that you've done, and that's the problem.
Athlete who will lose out on that spot. We're all about equality for women in sport. But right now, that equality's been taken away from us. Weightlifters come up to me and say, like, what do we do? Like, this isn't fair. What can we do? And unfortunately, there's nothing we can do, because every time we try to voice it, we get told to be quiet.
The strength
trying to go for the
go
double.
up, does pretty well, gets her on the ground. Now as you can see how her ground game goes.
Alana McLaughlin.
Even people who don't care about sports, you mentioned trans in sports, suddenly everyone has an opinion. And so do I, but it seems as if sometimes there's only one set of opinions that can be held, especially in my community. I was just
I mean, it's women's sports, who cares?
a college student trying to go to school for computer science. I decided one day, after being fed up on my college campus of just inherently knowing that I couldn't share my beliefs with my peers or my professors without being ostracized, I said, let me take to the internet. Let me make a YouTube video. I think I expected about 7 people to watch it, 5 being my family members. Woke up the next day, the video was going viral, and my life has changed dramatically ever since, and now I'm here. My first video was about feminism, which is funny because feminism used to be kind of like the centerpiece of online political discourse, and now it's a little less of a hot topic.
Well, it was just something that people just fucking spurred over. You know, you'd have a lot of dumb, like, lefty people, like, saying dumb shit, and then, like, there would be this huge counter-cultural movement against it because it was an easy pickings, you know? What's interesting about her take on feminism, though, is that it was kind of not good, right? So this is one of those things, right, where Blaire basically so when we look at anybody, everybody has privileges versus disprivileges, right? Depending on your various identities, where you grow up, et cetera, right? So there's male privilege and disprivilege, and there's female privilege and disprivilege, right? Now, it's really debatable about which one you think is more privileged versus more disprivileged. All I'll say is I've never met a man. Well, I've met more women who identify as women who would like to be, who wish they were men, than I've met men who identify as men that wish to be women, right? So to me, it seems like it's probably better to be a man, honestly. Doesn't mean it doesn't come with any negatives. That's just my perspective. But Blaire grossly downplayed the struggles of women. And I remember when I was seeing this, my first thought was like, you know, I had mentioned earlier in the show, in this segment, is that Blaire is somebody who developed as identifying as a male. And I think a significant amount of the struggles that women go through happen when their developmental cycle, like I said before, like getting turned away from particular fields of study and towards more being pushed more towards doing like housework and shit like that. And I see that dynamic constantly in my life, where there's higher and what's incredible is now women are expected to be equal, at least in my experience, but also do the same thing they used to do. So now it's like, hey, now you want to be equal, you have to go to work, but also you still have to take care of the house, right? And so these are things that are still kind of happening and still socially engineered and socially encouraged. And Blaire, growing up identifying as a male or expressing themselves as a male, didn't face those same problems. And so it's difficult. It's one of those things where it's kind of difficult for Blaire White to speak out against the struggles of women, which is what she was doing when she was making that point, because she didn't struggle as a woman in her early life. And that would be an example of like a controversial take, but expressing that respectably. So you could go, okay, I understand what you're saying.
But back then, that was the topic to talk about if you wanted to get canceled. So I transitioned at 20. It was the best decision of my life. I would never take it back. It opened up so many opportunities in my life. Obviously, it was right for me as a person. My earliest memories in life, probably 4 or 5 years old, was feeling gender dysphoria. So it was a feeling that escalated throughout my entire life, and I fixed it. I think that sometimes as YouTubers, commentators, whatever you want to call it, we can maybe feel as though we're very much hated outside of our supporters, obviously, because online it's a lot of hate. But in reality, if I go to an LGBT part of town, I can't really walk more than 5 feet without people saying that they're thankful for my content, they've been inspired by it. They can't publicly agree with me, but they'll let me know on the side. Being trans is not an ideology, it's not a It's not a belief system. It's just an aspect of who I am, not whole.
It's just funny to read the comments because this guy's like, oh, that's a sensible trans person I'm watching. Not like the trans person berating the Sonic employee. And it's like, oh my God. It's one of those things because I think that Blaire White is having a positive impact. Because when conservatives see a trans person that they agree with, it's like it will become less transphobic, which is a positive thing. But then also kind of relegates you to that like pick-me role where you're trans, but you don't necessarily get to express the true trans perspective on life. You know,
Whole of who I am, an aspect of who I am. And so the idea that I have to hold certain political opinions, certain beliefs, just based on that factor, which really shouldn't matter, I've never understood that. I'm a trans woman, period, point blank. I have no problem with that. I don't need to try to validate myself by running around saying that I am a biological female and that is my life, because that's not my life, that's not my experience. I think that biological women and trans women have very different experiences. There are obviously some similarities, some connections, some things you could
exactly, which kind of invalidates her perspective on feminism when she was younger.
Absolutely relate to, but there's a lot you can't. So the idea to blindly conflate the two when having scientific discussions is also a problem. So you have a lot of trans people going to hospitals and not disclosing that they're trans, and then they're getting the wrong treatment for certain things. That's just a reality, and it absolutely shouldn't be something that's controversial to say.
I don't think that
Biological
is.
sex is not changeable. You can obviously live your life your way that you want. I'm an example of that. Gender dysphoria, up until I think just a couple years ago, was always listed as a mental disorder. And for me, I'm all about destigmatizing mental health issues. I don't feel the need to bury the fact that it's clearly some sort of neurological condition that caused me to feel this way. I think if you're feeling those feelings at 4 years old, it's something there.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. So I'm going to, effectively what she's saying, I'm going to translate it for myself, is what she's saying to me is that we reclassified gender dysphoria from a mental health condition, I believe, to a sexual health condition, which to me just is not correct. It just doesn't make any sense. Logically, I think that gender dysphoria is a mental health issue. Problem is a lot of conservatives will say, well, it's just a mental illness in order to invalidate the struggles of trans people, which is why they reclassified it. Now, I think ideally the fight would be to destigmatize mental disorders, right? I believe ADHD is a mental disorder. Nobody invalidates me, right? It's more of just like a weapon that they can use against trans people. So I do agree with that. I do. I understand. But I also understand why they would reclassify it no longer as a mental health issue or as a mental illness, because again, you have people, ironically, at the Daily Wire, like Ben Shapiro, who will just invalidate someone's entire existence simply because they have a mental disorder. But when it comes to having some kind of a medical condition, the goal, and this is something I don't think that a lot of people who don't understand, this is my perspective, is that when you have a particular thing wrong with you, right? Like ADHD, that's wrong with me. It doesn't make me wrong. It just means I have a particular issue that I need help with to make sure that I can fit into society. That's what it's all about. Making sure that you can function in society the best as possible. And so when somebody has a particular issue, the goal should always be, how can we get that person to be as comfortable in society as possible, right? So what's the treatment? So the treatment for ADHD is probably going to be, it's going to be like self-management and medication, possibly. For a trans person, it depends on the person. There are people with gender dysphoria who the treatment really is identifying with their, like we'll call their birth sex, whatever you want to say. There are people who do. I've talked to with somebody who worked with people that are trans, and he said like, and it doesn't happen often, but the first thing that they lightly explore is, why the fuck am I subscribed to the Daily Wire? The fuck? Whatever. I don't even know why. Anyway, I didn't even realize that. Anyway, the first thing they explore is like, okay, could they be more comfortable exposed? If I liked the Daily Wire, like most things I subscribe to just for, you guys are saying like I got caught. No, if I subscribe to something, it's usually so that I get notifications when it comes up so I have content to talk about. I literally just don't remember subscribing to this channel, so I don't know why. Anyway, back to the main point. You guys are berating me in my own chat. There is an exploration of like, oh, you might be happier identifying with your birth, with your sex, and then going through counseling and whatever you may need. However, most trans people need, basically what happens is you will set a goal for yourself, or the therapist, the person you're working with will set a goal. You will set a goal for yourself of what you want to look like and how you want to express. And then as you move towards that goal, you'll try to ring in or rope in your expectations. So that's where I come from. What, like, you know, is the chance of success really high if we just beat trans people till they identify like as with their sex? No. So then that obviously doesn't make any sense. And so you guys are ridiculous. And so what do we lose as a society by accepting trans people? Well, you would basically you're blurring the lines a little bit between like male and female. And then I would say like is that really so bad? And I don't think so. I really don't care. It's not something that I think that we're losing as a society to blur the lines between male and female. I don't think that that's an issue. So it sounds like, yeah, let's affirming trans people, you know?
And so to me, it makes all the sense in the world to say gender dysphoria is a mental disorder, a mental health issue, and it should be treated as such, and people should work their way out of it in the way that they see fit. Search up the word detransition on YouTube. It's a growing number of young people who are facing this issue, who transition, end up regretting it. There's a very common narrative that they feel sucked into online discourse that maybe validates something in them that might not be so valid, which is those feelings of being trans. Obviously,
I mean, that could happen. Like, listen, I have a friend who detransitioned for sure, and their experience is that they thought that they had gender dysphoria, so they told like their therapist, or was it their psychiatrist? I don't know, that they had it, and the psychiatrist or the therapist or whatever was very affirming, and then they transitioned, and then they regretted it, and they transitioned back. And I don't doubt that that's something that's happening at all, but I also don't think that we're having the right conversation about trans people and detransitioning, et cetera, et cetera. In general, because a lot of people who detransition are a lot of people. There are a lot of young people who simply are transgenders. They identify as trans. This isn't a reflection of the trans community, and then their detransitioning is just like changing their clothes and like, you know, whatever, changing what they identify as. And so we can't conflate the two, because detransitioning really does specifically refer to, in my opinion, like people who have gone through some kind of a medical transition, because or else there's really no negative impact on your body, you know. So
transitioners don't make up the entire trans community. There's plenty of people who transition and are happy about it. But the idea that we can only talk about the ones on the happy end of the spectrum, especially when there's kids doing it, I think is an issue. So I've made a point to interview a lot of them on my channel, and they're some of my most watched videos, some of the ones people find the most compelling, because you'll have a 16-year-old girl who removed her breasts, underwent testosterone, has a permanently deep voice because of it. And it's tragic, and they're definitely censored themselves. They're not allowed to tell their stories. They face a ton of backlash within the community, and that definitely needs to change. I think that a more general and all-encompassing discussion on this topic, especially because it's so complex, is what we need, not censorship of one side or the other. I think that there is a phenomenon that happens sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, with parents of trans kids, that it becomes their identity to an extent, that them being the parent of a trans child is suddenly, you see it in a lot of them, they have online personas because of it. That can lead to maybe an unhealthy attachment towards their kid being trans, and if that
I don't disagree with that
feeling happens to change, the parents might not be as willing to allow it to change.
I don't necessarily disagree with that. I do think that there is a biological and an environmental component to being trans, and it depends on the person. Everybody's different, right? And I'm sure that there are parents who their kid might have like, let's say they have a boy, and the boy's like, I like dresses. All of a sudden, you like dresses, you like dolls, you like this, you like that, and they are over affirming, and they don't give kids time to explore themselves. Like if my kid's like, my boy's like, I like dresses, I'm like, okay, you know. And if they were like, I want to wear a dress, I mean, I talked to my wife. Maybe I'd say okay, and then I would just not give them a dress, you know. And then if they kept bothering about it, we would explore from there. But you know, you don't need to dive all in when your kid expresses a thing. You know, if your kid's like, oh, I like this thing, you don't have to just fucking jump into it like head first. Which I think is what she's talking about. I don't know how rampant that is. I think it's something that we should talk about to discourage that type of behavior. Because I'm sure there are like parents who think that it's trendy to have a trans kid and they like to kind of, you know, use that. But, you know, I would say is like, let your kid explore themselves. Like, let your kid kind of like chill. Like, let them explore themselves. You don't have to, You know, be super like affirming if they say something. You don't have to fucking come if they're like, oh, I might be trans, you know? You don't have to go ballistic. And it's the same thing across the board. Like, if your kid's like, oh, I like sports, you don't have to be like, oh, well, let's do this, let's do that, let's do that. You know, you don't have to force your kid into like a thing. You can allow them to explore themselves, and I think that's what we're lacking nowadays is like let kids explore themselves. That's what makes more sense, and it's across the board. It's not just when it comes to trans shit or trans issues. Sorry, it's trans shit. Oh, sorry.
There was a documentary called Transhood, I believe, on HBO recently. And there was a boy who, from the age of, I think, 5 or 6, wanted
Yeah, Digital Princess is doing that to her son. That's 4. Yeah.
to wear dresses, like the color pink. By the time he turns 10, he said, actually, Mom and Dad, I'm a boy. I don't want to be a girl. And the mother would not let it go. The mother actually went into a depression because the child wasn't trans. So as opposed to just supporting your child on their journey they're on regardless, it can't become their own journey. And that happens sometimes. I think there's a certain inclination to only talk about the success stories of trans people. That once you transition, your life is set and you're happy and everything's great. When in reality, for me, transitioning was the jump off. It was like, I'm gonna get this over with, and then I'm gonna move on to building a career, having a family, building a real life. There's life after transition, and that's never discussed really. Permanently altering your body is much more of an adult decision. I get hundreds of emails a day, and as long as I'm getting hundreds of emails from people saying that they made a mistake, that they regret it, that all of that, I'm probably gonna be more inclined to believe it should be done as an adult, or at least in the very late teen years at the very minimum.
Who sends fucking emails anymore, honestly? You know what I'm saying? Like, who sends a goddamn email anymore? I don't think that's true. I don't know. But yeah, no, I tend to agree. Like, I don't think so. A kid that under 18 should be able to choose to transition. I don't feel particularly comfortable about puberty blockers. I don't know. I mean, I guess that's up to the... I don't know. I'm not comfortable with puberty blockers. I remember there's this trans person on TikTok, and I was talking to my detransitioning friend, or detransitioned friend, about this. And I talked to the trans person on TikTok. This was one of the first like little things I did on TikTok. And I you know, I don't have the podcast up anymore, I don't think. But anyway. And she had mentioned that when she was younger, she had low testosterone, and that might have had something to do with them identifying as trans. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. And I didn't think anything of it. And then my detransitioning friend, that she said, well, to me afterwards, she's like, well, why didn't she just take more testosterone then? Right? And why wasn't that a potential treatment? And that got me thinking. It's like, oh, interesting. You know what I mean? Like there could be potentially different treatment methods, but which is up to the individual. It's just something to think about. I'm not really super into kids taking hormones, although I guess I did to an extent potentially advocate for kids taking more testosterone, you know, but I don't know, man. That's a touchy subject because I don't have a kid that has this problem. And I imagine if I had a kid that legitimately had this problem where they were trans, I would probably be more open to giving them puberty blockers because I don't want my kid to be upset. And I'm not the kind of person that if my kid was like, oh, I'm trans, I'd be like, oh my God, let's go and trans you up. No, I would take like the proper steps, and I would take my time to make sure that they are transitioning in like an acceptable way. And I think that's the biggest problem is that we don't trust each other as parents anymore to do the right thing for our kids, which happens a lot. You know, you look at Pokey Princess, she abandoned her digital princess. She like fucking left her kid in the house to go have sex with some guy at like fucking 10 o'clock at night for over an hour. You know, the kid got it out of the house and ran to the street, or could have run to the street and gotten really hurt. So I guess there's a lot of problems here. It's hard to say because I don't want to make like a general. I don't feel comfortable with kids transitioning. But like it's just a hard thing, you know.
But you have 12-year-olds going on puberty blockers. They tend to not develop in a way that is needed to have an actual sex change. Jazz Jennings is an example. She has a reality show. She's a young trans girl, and there's nothing against her. I think she's a great person, and I think she's cool. But because of her going on medication so young, they couldn't even give her the sex change she wanted all her life because she didn't develop to the point where that was possible.
I wish you would explain that because I don't understand what you're talking about.
They took me to the doctor when I was 3 years
Okay,
old, and she held up 2 dolls. One doll was a girl and had girl parts, and one doll was a boy and had boy parts. And she said, which do you have right now? And I pointed to the boy doll. And then she said, which do you want? And I pointed to the girl doll.
I would say that I have a girl brain and a boy body, and I think like a girl, but I just have a boy body.
The problem I have with that is that there's no way like a 5-year-old understands that much of depth, or 3, however old they are in that scenario. I guess they said that she was 3. If you like, I wouldn't doubt it if a kid would say, "Oh, that's the doll I look like, and that's the doll I want to look like." I do doubt that a kid's like, "Well, I have a female brain, but I'm in a male's body." I don't really believe that. I don't think kids have that much of a depth of thought understanding. And to me, this Jazz Jennings scenario, based on that, really, to me, suggests that her parents were very forceful of the narrative that she's trans. And this is what we were talking about just before. I was like, oh, they might express themselves as trans in some extent. And then they might say like, oh, I think I want to be a girl, which might happen. And then they jump on it and they're like, okay, let's express. Let me just tell you all these different things about trans people. Let the kid explore. Like, that's one of the biggest problems, right, for trans people, just people in general, is trying to feel like they need to fit into this dome of society. And societal pressures come from not only society, but being educated on society. So if you're a kid, you're not educated on society, which can be a good thing. It gives you the ability to mentally explore yourself. And so if you're educating your kid about like, oh, I'm a girl in a boy's body and this and that, and you're really going on a tangent about it, I don't think that you're allowing your kid to explore themselves the proper way.
You have to have conversations about all of it, not just half of it. There's a lot of, my pronouns are doll, vampire. It's really a costume for a lot of people.
What are neopronouns? They're basically your own custom pronouns. When no other pronouns seem to fit, you come up with your own pronouns. Anything can really be a pronoun.
I just came up with new neopronouns that combine he, him, she, her, and they, them. We have them so they've combined he and she as well.
The, them, theirs. I mean, I would just ask this person their name and say, okay, I'm not going to call you that. That's silly.
Everybody gets you with the, them, theirs today.
I just added Bug to my list of pronouns. Bug wanted to go to the store by Bug's self.
But the unfortunate thing is that
it's one of those things where it's like where you put up an obvious target. It's like nobody agrees with that person, so let's shit on them, and then that somehow makes your perspective better. You know what I mean? But like nobody thinks that Bug self is, no real fucking trans person is like, yeah, Bug is totally valid. And if you do, fuck you. I don't care if you're trans or not. It's dumb.
87 gender crowd is often conflated with being a transsexual, which is what I am. I don't relate to that crowd. I don't find similarities in our narrative, in our life story. But when I meet other transsexuals, there's obviously...
What I feel like isn't transsexual just like a dated term? Like, isn't a trans person? Or I guess maybe Blaire. There we go. She chose the name Blaire. Should have chose a better name, girl. Anyway, I guess she's trying to say like transsexual be like your trans medical person, I guess, for lack of a better term, somebody who medically transitions, whereas transgender would be somebody who doesn't do that, which I guess is fine. I guess that's the way that she's trying to express it, which I suppose is fine.
Things I can compare it with that crowd, not so much. I
That
think
makes sense.
that, like all trends, it will eventually die out. I think that in many ways, it's like the new emo. It's the new attention-seeking. You know, everyone has it in their profile.
All right, I can't believe everybody's shitting on me for shitting on the name Blaire. I guess it's not that bad. Sorry, guys. Okay.
Even if they don't really need to, like you have just a straight up like biological man or woman who looks like a biological man or woman, and they want to put it in their description. I think that a lot of people come at it from a good place, but it is really interesting to see, being trans myself, that like it's kind of a show for a lot of people, is kind of virtue signaling that these are my pronouns, these are my pronouns. Being trans isn't a trend for actual trans people.
Is she talking about people who are cis?
It's kind of place. Woman, they want to put it a straight up like biological man or woman who looks like a biological man or woman, and they want to put it in their description. A straight up like has it in their profile, even if they don't really need to. Like you have just...
Okay, she's talking about people who like are cisgendered that put their pronouns in the bio. Like I get what you're saying. Like it could be a signal of like, hey, I'm a good affirming trans person. Virtue signaling. It could also just be like an effort to make trans people feel more comfortable expressing themselves. You know what I mean? It's a very small thing to do that I don't think is bad. Now I don't do it. because I don't give a shit. But I'm not going to shit on somebody who says that they're he, him when they are, you know, a cis male. They're just trying to signal to trans people that they're trans affirming. It's not that big of a deal.
A show for a lot of people is kind of,
which is a good thing, right? Because we're having a conversation about like cisgendered means you identify with your sex. Like I'm cisgendered male. I'm a gender male, sex male. All right. If I'm a trans person, I would be like, I'm a trans male. I'd be like a biological woman, gender male. Anyway, like I was saying before, signaling to people that you're trans affirming is a good thing, right? Because we're having this conversation about telling some of your partner that you're trans before sleeping with them, which you should do. But one of the reasons that some trans people don't, one of the reasons is because they just think that some people won't fuck them, and that's obviously shitty. But then some of the reasons is because they don't feel comfortable and they feel like they might get hurt. And so if you're somebody who signals that you're trans affirming by putting your pronouns in the bio or whatever, that could signal to that trans person that they could comfortably come out to you, and that would be like a positive thing. And I think that, you know, both sides need to be worked on. Obviously, trans people need to express that they're trans to their partner before physical engagement, but then also we should, as a society, become more trans affirming, so that people don't feel like they're going to get killed if they express that they're trans.
You signaling that these are my pronouns, these are my pronouns. Being trans isn't a trend for actual trans people. It's like, this is something that is, like I said, a reality for me since I was a very young child, and it never went away. So the idea that it's reduced to virtue signaling and show ponying, and it's frustrating for sure. And I talked to a lot of other trans people who are extremely frustrated with it. I've never talked to an actual real trans person who was even remotely okay with it.
That's like what we're talking about, where she says like real trans person. That's where people start getting upset with her, because it's like, oh, you're a real trans person or you're a fake trans person, you know. And that's the language that would cause people to be upset with her.
It's just more so everything you pretend to be okay with to keep your reputation in the community. It would be a luxury if the only issue I could base my voting on, my passions on, were trans issues. There's so much more going on in the world I care about. The idea that I shouldn't be voting based on how I feel about foreign policy, immigration, the border, COVID, like, those are all things I care infinitely more about, and those are the things that are gonna shape how I live my life and my choices.
So the thing that I find, like, I'm totally fine with most of the things that she said, except for the one thing that she said. And she said it would be a luxury for me if I could vote, if I just had to vote based on my transness. I don't think it's a luxury for people to have to vote based on one particular identity. I think it's a crutch, right? So most trans people, I would say that most trans people, when they are looking for a political party to support, they're probably going to support the party that thinks that they're a person, right? Which, of course, might hinder other perspectives that they have. Maybe they do have like a more conservative perspective on like foreign policy and the way in which to reduce unemployment and then, you know, stimulate the economy. But because they're told, like, basically that they're not valid people by conservatives, they have to vote, you know, I guess more progressively, so that they can have the basic rights first. Right, use building blocks. First, you got to be considered a human being before you can start expressing your human being perspectives and thoughts. And of course, there are some people who hive mind and just go like progressive and they don't care. But I think a lot of people are more. In my opinion, I think that you know, we talk about things like white privilege and stuff, and I think that I would boil white privilege down more than anything else to not necessarily being white, but to not having. But to not understand what it's like to identify as white, if that makes sense, right? So people who, you know, so most white people aren't white people. They're just people. That's how the white people see themselves, myself included, right? So as a white person, I just see myself as a person. And I see other people as people. I see other black people as people. Problem is in that a lot of black people's lives, for instance, or trans people's lives, the first thing that they see is their skin color or their particular thing that makes them marginalized, because they have to, because it's still an issue for them. So they get treated differently based on their skin color. They'll notice differences in ways that they're treated just in general by society. And so the privilege more than anything else is like not having to identify with your identities. That's the privilege that you'd have more than anything else. And that's a good privilege, and that's great. And it makes it so that you can be less biased, because you get to have a more open mind, or you get to, you know, you get to express your priorities on other things other than just your race. Thank you so much for the resub. But the reason people focus on their identity is usually because they have to, because it's part of their life still, because they've been treated differently for their identity. And that's the thing that I don't think that Blaire understands. It's like, that's why I would say most trans people vote trans over other policy, because they're still trans people, right? Society still looks at them and says, and points the finger and says trans. Or it's like, oh, trans or black or Hispanic or Asian or gay. And people don't do that to straight people. Nobody points to me and says straight, right? Nobody points to me and says white. On the internet, sure, but that's just an annoying, obnoxious fuckfest. But for the most part, I've never been pointed at in my life and gone white. And so, like, I have the privilege of not identifying with my race. And that's the issue. And there are black people and gay people, et cetera, like Blaire, trans person. They don't have to identify heavily with their identity. And then that is one of the things that makes you disconnect and not understand these types of situations.
I think it goes back to treating it as an ideology, treating trans as an ideology, but it's really just a group of people. And you see this with all minorities. You see people that are black told they have to vote a certain way. Look at the Larry Elder incident. You had a white woman.
Yes, I've been called white boy too. Being called a white boy isn't something that like destroys your entire identity, makes you have to focus on being white. Like, it's not the same. If you think that being called a white boy is that big, you probably aren't really forced to look at your race. You know what I mean?
In a gorilla mask, assaulting him. And
how do you know that's not like a that's the person's not identifying as a gorilla, Blaire? Transphobic much?
Somehow that white woman isn't racist because she's liberal.
That shit
so
was
oddly
racist,
enough, I think it was my transition that pushed me towards being on the right. I'm a Republican. I think that people maybe have a misconception that because I'm trans, that there was once upon a time where I was
it's not Harambe.
a Democrat, voting Democrat, never voted for a Democrat in my life. You know, I'm a Republican. Am I gonna sit here and say that I am a Christian conservative who holds all of those beliefs? Absolutely not. But the Republican Party as it stands now is probably the most closely aligned with my beliefs. No one can sit here and say that the right has been amazing to trans people or amazing on trans issues.
I mean, I would honestly say they haven't even been like decent on trans issues. You know what I mean? It's not like it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, they're not super supportive of us, but they're okay with us. It's not really one of those things. It's one of those things where it's like, yeah, you're generally speaking, your best bet for being a trans conservative for the most part is just like where people will just not talk about it. You know what I mean? Like and I think that's progress from a social perspective, but it's like, you know, you're in a space as a Republican and people just, they can kind of, maybe they can tell you're trans, but they just keep, that's that person. I'm not going to ask them about it. I'm not going to worry about it. That's your best case scenario, is people just ignore your identity. Worst case scenario, you're dead. You know what I mean? So
that would be a bit of a delusion. However, I think that a lot of people get very mad that I exist in that realm, in the right-wing world, and that I do videos for the Daily Wire, and that I'm open about my views. But wouldn't you rather have someone like me have a seat at the table and be able to be part of the conversation rather than secluding ourselves to one side? I garnered a sense of independence, self-reliance, self-growth that is definitely more of a staple on that end. So I think that it only made sense, you know, if I'm gonna take responsibility and change my life and shape it in the way I want, then that's gonna be that.
Okay, that was something. Thanks, Blaire. Really nice.